Good morning and welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining today's WorkCom Blitz Risk Manager panel discussion. A lot of interest in today's discussion because it's COVID madness, the federal mandates, and all of the craziness that, we've all been dealing with over the last couple of years, and COVID continues to be the gift that keeps on giving. So before we get started, definitely want to make sure that wishing you, colleagues, friends, family, all that we're doing well, we're staying healthy, whether you're working from home or in the office or a hybrid model. Definitely want to make sure that you guys are all staying healthy and doing well. So again, thank you for joining. And before we get started, and as we're having some folks continue to filter on, just want to run through a quick disclaimer for today's panel discussion, and just want to make it clear that the opinions and perspectives of all of our panelists are those of their own and not their respective organizations. These are obviously perspectives and opinions that they formed through years of being in the risk management industry and the last couple of years of having to deal with all the COVID claims. So this is not legal advice, and so it shouldn't be construed as such. But of course, if you have any questions, we've got two fantastic attorneys that would love to be able to field those questions separately or at the end of the call, which kind of leads us to the next point, is that for today's discussion, we certainly want it to be an engaging conversation. I know that there's a lot of strong opinions about what's going on, and we want you to feel comfortable asking these questions with the question and answer chat function. So feel free to ask any questions. You can type those in, and we will do our best to filter through those and direct those to the panelists during the course of the discussion and during, in the flow of that discussion. So now that we've kind of laid the groundwork for all that, I'd love to introduce our all-star panel today. Definitely excited to have every one of you here, and of course, all the attendees. And so just starting up top, we've got Brent Rose, founder of Black & Rose Law Firm. They're a work comp defense law firm in California. They've got offices throughout the state. They do a fantastic job, and they've also got an employment law component to that. And Brent is a personal friend. He's a legal whiz and avid fisherman. And I'm pretty sure he's probably got a statue of his escapades fishing wise in Cabo San Lucas. So Brent, thanks for joining us. Glad to have you.
Thank you. Thank you. That was quite the introduction, Josh. Wow.
I've got to keep it going. So
thanks for having me, and I appreciate it and look forward to getting on with this.
Excellent. Excellent. So next up, our other attorney and a legal expert on the panel, Matt Soleimanpour. So Matt is founder of Soleiman Law. It's a civil defense firm that specializes in employment law, subrogation, and they've also got a work comp component to their firm as well. So Matt has also been featured in quite a few attorney publications, and recently has been involved in some high-profile COVID-related claims. So he's been pretty frequent on a lot of the television shows and referenced in Forbes and a lot of other websites. So Matt, we're thrilled to have you today. And definitely looking forward to your insight on today's topic.
Thank you, Josh. Happy to be here. Thanks, guys.
Excellent. So rounding it out, we've got Anthony Santos. Anthony Santos is the safety and work comp manager at Think Together. It's a nonprofit organization that caters to underprivileged students in various school districts, and he oversees close to 3,000 employees. That sounds like it's growing by the minute. So Anthony also has a really interesting background in that he's got some examiner, some paralegal, and really just kind of well-rounded in the insurance industry as well. So Anthony, I know you go by Tony. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you, Josh. Thank you, everyone.
Excellent. Next up, Veda Mabry. Everybody knows Veda. She's been an awesome contributor to a lot of our panel discussions and always willing to kind of jump in and share her experiences. So thanks for joining Veda. She is the human resource and safety manager at PacSun, obviously a large organization, pretty interesting sort of just culture fit that she's going to get into, in a bit here, but definitely some awesome experiences that she brings in her 18 years at PacSun. So thanks for joining us, Veda.
Yeah, thanks, Josh. Excited to be here.
Excellent. So next up, Liz Flores, and she is the Director of HR at Don Roberto Jeweler. She's also the Vice Chair of the South County chapter of PIRA, which is the Professionals in Human Resource Association. She's very well known, very well respected in her circles, and she has a lot to share. Also has a pretty diverse background that I'm sure is going to contribute to all of her, discussion points today. So Liz, absolutely, thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you, Josh.
You bet. And then last, but certainly not least, we've got Tania Matulewicz, and she is the Manager of Risk Management at Vallerta Supermarkets. And before that, she spent quite a bit of time on a claims desk, like me and a few other the folks on these panels. And so she oversees more than 50 locations, several thousand employees, and has just an awesome background in everything that she's done. And she's been a great contributor to the industry, and has joined me in HERMA and a few other organizations. And so just happy to have your experiences on this panel today, Tania.
Thank you.
So now that we've got that out of the way, let's go ahead and jump into the discussion. Obviously, there is, I mentioned before, just a lot of thoughts, opinions, worries, anxiety about, the federal mandate and all that comes along with that. So kind of leading off, Brent, I'd like to kick it to you to maybe just kind of do your best to summarize that federal mandate, maybe just get us a high level overview of what it is, what it means, and who appears to be impacted in this early stage.
All right, thank you, Josh. Yeah, so we all saw the announcement or heard of the announcement in early September from President Biden. Basically, the vaccine mandate that he proposed is that all federal workers and well as contractors that do contract work with the federal government need to be vaccinated. I think federal employees specifically, that date, the hard date that they have to be vaccinated is December 8th. It also applies to private employers when they have more than 100 employees. For private employers, it's a little bit of a different breakdown in that private employers with 100 employees or more need to have their staff vaccinated, or they need to test their employees every week. It's a little bit of a difference there because federal employees are not allowed that sort of testing condition or carve out. It also applies to 17 million healthcare workers in hospitals, clinics, and facilities that accept Medicare or Medicaid. So if you are one of those facilities that accept either form of federal monies, then those employees also need to be covered. It applies to 300,000 employees of a program called Head Start Early Childhood Education. It's basically a federally funded education program, and those people also sort of fall into that category. I think one of the biggest misunderstandings, or maybe it is an understanding of everybody, is this is to be tasked by OSHA. So the federal the president actually tasked OSHA to now take these mandates, put them into law, and then try to regulate them across the nation. So I think once OSHA comes out with these standards, they're looking at a lot of different things when they're sort of crafting the final version of these rules. But they are the ones that are going to be regulating this particular mandate. So some of the hurdles with OSHA, if and when they do finally come out with it, we all know it's going to be, hopefully, they think in the next 3 weeks. I'm sure they're sort of working day and night to try to get these implemented into their program. One of the biggest obstacles is that at the start of 2020, OSHA had about 861 employees. They lost about 65 employees since that time. So they have around 800 employees. I know they're on a mad dash to hire. right now to try to get more employees, because OSHA is the one that is going to be regulating these vaccine mandates. One of the things about the vaccine mandates that is sort of interesting is that it only applies to states that use the OSHA federal laws in their state. There's actually about half of the states in this country that have their own regulatory board. California happens to be one of them, which is the Division of Occupational Safety and Health. So if you don't actually use those federal guidelines, this does not actually apply to your state, although we're all in California here. So we're specifically speaking of California, and I'm pretty sure that the governor in California is definitely going to adopt these into our program. But it was interesting because some of the states that seem to be in more conflict, I would say, with the president, Texas, Florida, and whatnot, they are actually under these OSHA guidelines. So they don't have a choice when it comes to this, because federal law is to trump state law. Matt can speak of the legal issues a little bit later or whatnot, but so it's actually going to be regulated by OSHA. So that was the kind of, nobody really knew what the regulatory board was going to be, but that is the regulatory board and the people it covers.
Thanks. That was a pretty darn good summary there, Brent. I know there was a lot to unpack that, so I think you did a good job of kind of packing it all into a short summary. So thanks for that. And that does kind of lead into the next question that I'd like to pose to Matt. Based on all of those things that we just outlined, and Brent already kind of alluded to some of the challenges as to where it'll apply in some of the states in which it may or may not. What do you see as just some of the initial legal challenges kind of at the onset that we can expect with regard to this mandate?
Well, as we all know, these are kind of polarizing times right now. So anytime you have a sweeping decision like this, or executive order, or as Brent laid out, a OSHA workplace rule, which is how they're going to basically enforce this, there's going to be mounting legal challenges from the other end. There's a couple competing schools of thought as to the efficacy of these vaccination mandates and how it might impact individuals' freedoms and whatnot. And there's going to be corresponding challenges, of course. Now, at the federal level, we foresee some difficulty in the enforcement of these federal guidelines. There's been a little bit of pushback in that respect. Now, as Brent laid out, we're still waiting on the California rules, but eventually we're going to have those. And if you're just kind of reading the tea leaves, the federal OSHA mandates could potentially face some legal challenges and enforcement. But my personal opinion is once California puts the similar guidelines into place, California actually probably has a better chance of upholding these mandates than it would in other states or even at the federal level, just by looking at the past decisions that have come down. So Cal OSHA recently had its emergency workplace rule held up by a state court judge, and that's why we believe that in California, once those rules come down, it's going to be what it is out here. So the next stage is how do employers deal with that enforcement? We're not quite sure 100%, as Brent identified, how that's going to come to be. But anybody that's dealt with OSHA, as the way that they get employers to enforce certain matters is via fines. And right now, there is a federal guideline that allows for $14,000 fines from a federal OSHA perspective. California, again, we're still waiting on the instruction there, but there was a recent fine, in fact, that was levied on San Quentin Prison that was in excess of $400,000. So we'll get into the employer landmines in that respect as we kind of wade through this conversation. But long story short, if you're a California employer, you should probably be ready to have some of these general policies implemented, because we don't really foresee California courts coming to the rescue of employers on what they need to do with respect to either enforcing the mandates or passing that responsibility on to somebody else. So that's kind of our lay of the land right now. There's the legal challenges in essence right now deal with this issue of freedoms, as I laid out in my opening statement. So what courts are going to decide is, is this something that is impinging on our ability to live our everyday lives? And what courts have identified thus far is that employment is not, something that is a inalienable right, so to speak. It's a choice. So if these mandates come out, well, then the employee has a choice to leave the job if he or she is not, comfortable with going ahead and moving forward with it. So again, we don't believe the substance of the mandates is going to get overturned. It could be a little bit of the enforceability, but California employers, we really need to get ready, and we're going to give you some points on how you can affect what the costs are going to be as these mandates kind of come to more clear fruition. How we go about communicating with our employees, what's recommended to go ahead and do that. So I'm going to pass it to Josh so he can lay that out for you. But just one thing to keep in mind before I do that is, best thing for employers to do is think about reasonable accommodations. Think about your process of reasonable accommodations, and that's going to be the best way for you to tackle it. So I'm going to pass it over, and then we'll get into those specific topics and what our tips would be to address this moving forward.
Yeah, one of the to play off of Matt really quick, one of the things I did note in OSHA's press release is that I think as far as the enforcement piece to this is they indicated that they are going to be relying extremely heavily on whistleblowing. That is going to be sort of their method in which they really regulate this. Is they're hoping other people call employers out. So that was sort of interesting, sort of as well, as a piece of it, because the enforcement of it would just sound to be a task that is insurmountable. So I think they're going to use a lot of whistleblowing to regulate that.
Yeah.
Right. And then the individual challenges, of course, are going to be based off of, religious beliefs or disabilities. So when you're having issues with specific employees and what they do or do not want to do, those are going to be the two primary areas where that employers could face potential legal action when employers are actually trying to implement these particular mandates. So again, that's where the interactive process is going to assist you. But again, I'll get more into that as we wade through this later, because I want to make sure that we're kind of hitting all these points for you one by one. So before we leave here, we'll ensure that you have all our best practices in that respect.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. We definitely want to jump into that. And you guys did a great job of just kind of laying, like you said, the lay of the land as far as what we're dealing with and what the picture, kind of the landscape looks like now. So I'd like to pass it to Liz Flores to get her thoughts on this, right? So there's so much that we just laid out. So, from an employer perspective, where do you even start? Where do you even start with the planning, with all the unknowns that we outlined, and sort of, the unknown kind of timetables and, legal landmines that could potentially be there that we may not even know yet? How does an employer even start figuring out what the next steps look like?
Those are really good loaded questions, Josh. Do we even have the time, honestly? I think I speak for the majority of employers out there. It has been a very overwhelming, frustrating year and a half. For our industry here, we're retail chain stores, and we are throughout the 58 counties of California. So not only are we having to follow the Cal OSHA regulations, we're also having to make sure that we're also abiding by the county guidelines. So we're having to mix and match. What does Cal OSHA want us to do? What does the county want us to do? And so there's a underlying different regulations that we have to make sure that we are complying with, and also making sure that our employees are abiding by those regulations, not only to mention also our customers, because we are retail chain stores. We do have to also make sure that our customers are following the regulations. Yet that is also a very sensitive area for us, because we do not want to upset our customers when they're walking into a store and saying, well, I'm fully vaccinated, I don't have to wear my mask. And we're thinking, well, unfortunately, this county does require you to wear a mask inside and outside. So those are some of the challenges where we don't want to obviously upset customers, but also in the same line, we're also trying to stay into business and we don't want to lose customers. So it's been quite challenging as far as the area of the mandate now, this is going to become a requirement, is we've had candidates who say, well, you know what, thanks, but no thanks, but I don't want to wear a mask 8 hours a day. And so I don't really need to go in there and work. I probably just do part-time hours, but yeah, thanks, but no thanks. And we're at a time right now where we're entering our busy season. So we need all the help we can get right now. And so it's been a little bit challenging because we have been finding that there's a lot of candidates that don't want to work right now. Between stimulus checks going out and obviously unemployment, we've had employees that have actually committed to starting and then show up for 2 days and then don't show up anymore. And what does that do? That restarts their whole EDD benefits. So it's a situation where it's very, very tough right now. I would have to say this is probably one of the most challenging times, aside from COVID last year where everything was shut down. But right now it is very challenging because we are having a very hard time finding candidates to work.
Yeah, no, thanks for that insight. And definitely something that I'd like to touch on a bit as far as the staffing and the sort of the COVID fallout from all that too. So we're going to certainly touch on that in a bit here. But Veda, I'd like to get your take on this. You and I have kind of chatted about this, in the past, but culture is in large part, can be impacted by, by all this, everything going on, right? And so there needs to be a conscious decision as to how, how the discussions are being had, how the communication, is being relayed. You've got an interesting sort of makeup of employees. Can you kind of just share a little bit about what the questions that you've been fielding, sort of the what the outreach has been, or just the response from employees kind of wondering what the next steps look like?
Yeah, I was out when COVID started. I went on furlough for 4 months, only to come back to, a plan that had already been put in place. We were working, stores were working. There were some employees, there were some associates in the store who were doing some mail outs, but there wasn't a full staff and there weren't customers coming in. So when customers started coming in, and then we had to start tracking COVID and going through all of the presumptions, which is another topic of crazy. The first thing on their mind, because our associates in our stores are young, they're hourly, and they work probably anywhere from 10 to 15 hours a week. And somebody who gets COVID, the first thing they ask is, am I going to get paid? Mm-hmm. That affects the culture. And I think Liz can attest to this. That affects your culture because they're thinking, well, if I get COVID, I come to work sick anyways. Before COVID, associates would come to work with a bad cold. That was fine. But now you're telling somebody that, you have the sniffles, you're running a temperature, you can't come to work. Okay, they're thinking, I can't get paid. So thank goodness that, the governor put into place where those associates who do get COVID now get paid if they're out. They do have, I think it's 80 hours of sick time that they can get. And so now they are telling us when they are sick, where before no one would tell us if they were sick. I remember calling on the phone and talking to somebody in the store, and they would be, hello, hello, coughing. And I'm thinking, are you sick? Oh yeah, I got a really bad cold. Well, why are you there? Because I have to work. And they, because there's no sick time. And so it's trying to instill in that young culture that it's okay not to work. Don't come to work if you're sick. Stay home, take care of yourself. You're going to get paid. And when you're well, then you can come back.
Yeah, appreciate the insight on that. So, so Tony, I'd like to get your take on this too. We mentioned roughly 3,000 employees and sort of the dissemination of the message, right? So how it gets relayed to employees about what's going on. What has been the strategy that has been effective, for you or that you guys are considering implementing for delivering the message to employees about next steps? You're on mute, Tony.
Thanks, Josh. Our company, we're a nonprofit and we're 90% at school sites. So while we have the health department orders for school districts, we also have local school districts that have their laws or regulations and mandates. So we try to recommend vaccinations, but give them a choice. But if we have a district that requires entering their campus, you must have a vaccine, then we'll try and say, according to LAUSD, any employee that enters a school site in their school district must have a vaccination. We try and word it as a way of, this is not us, we recommend it, it's proven, everything the CDC says, but the health department and the school district have now required it. Therefore, we kind of not push blame, but push the requirement onto them, and not so much as we are pushing it as a private employer. So in theory, a lot of our employees, about 80% are on campus sites. They can't enter campus without showing a vaccination. Some don't even have the testing option. And it's unfortunate. And Veda, back to your point, yes, everyone used that 80 hours of sick time, especially right up to September 30th when it expired. So now they're lost again. They have no idea. And most of our workers are also 15 to 18 hours. And they're, young culture. So it's very tough to get some employees that will actually report symptoms because they know now they will not get paid sick time.
And can I say something to that, Tony? It's that, the holidays are coming and, we're ramping up the stores with new associates. And again, not being able to get paid that 80 hours and holiday, it's the busiest time for us. It's who is going to come into the store sick? Are we going to see another, COVID outbreak, amongst everybody? Because again, they took that away. So now everybody's going to show up again. Mm-hmm. And you're probably going to, maybe you might affect your store, you might affect your customers. You don't know really, we're kind of in that time where we don't really know what's going to happen because they did take that 80 hours away from us. So it's going to be interesting.
Yeah, I think the big takeaway that I like that Tony had outlined there is that the delivery of the message could be, hey, we aren't the bad guy, right? Particularly when it comes to the us against them culture that can happen from an employer standpoint if you guys appear to be the target of these things. But when you're saying, look, this isn't us, we are following the government outlines, health department guidelines, CDC guidelines, and kind of say, look, this is what we're simply implementing this. And I think that can help from a culture standpoint where it's like, okay, this isn't my employer forcing this on me, and then having to deal with the fallout from that. Placing the blame, so to speak, on the entities that are essentially mandating this, I think can probably go a long way, again, from a culture standpoint, from a maybe morale standpoint as well, particularly when you've got the folks that are, against the mandate. Right. So thanks for that. I wanted to get an idea from, and maybe Liz, maybe you can chime in on this one here, but with the mandate, all of the onus falls on employers to track this, to make all these determinations, right? To follow up on the testing on top of all the other things that we were required to do, notify the work comp carrier with, for any positive tests. the health department for potential outbreaks, all the things that are kind of fall on the employer. Can you maybe kind of just shed some light on just the resources and just, being kind of stretched thin in this environment where all of it kind of just falls on you guys essentially to have to carry a large part of the load?
I mean, I have to tell you, when this all hit and, we had to furlough all of our employees, we immediately went into policy and procedure mode, especially because we had a good amount of our workforce working from home, which was something that we had, maybe once or two or three people. But then now it was like, okay, now we need to implement a COVID policy working from home. Because even though you're working from home, we still want to make sure that your household understands that while you're working, you still need to be considered safe and make sure that you're considering your safety, your protection, still wearing your mask. So we implemented that. We implemented the COVID self-check policy, where it's like every day you need to monitor your symptoms every day. And, that's something that we're probably going to have to go back to now, like Veda was saying, now that the SPSL has now expired. Going back to self-checking, making sure that, hey, are you feeling, body aches, sniffles, headaches, fever, all those things that SPSL gave us a little bit of coverage. But now it is going to be a little bit more challenging, because when you are in the retail industry, you're not just thinking about your employees coming in sick, you're also thinking about customers coming in sick. And especially if you have those that, are very liberal in the sense of, hey, I'm fully vaccinated, I'm not wearing my mask, I should be okay. And a lot of times, they really are not fully aware of the county guidelines or the Cal OSHA guidelines. For example, I know Cal OSHA is requiring all employers to carry N95 masks. We have been trying to find the N95 masks being available. It's been challenging, and one of the other things that we've also have found out is that a lot of the suppliers have actually tripled the price on N95 masks now. So there's a lot of challenges, but we have provided all of our stores with sanitizing supplies, making sure that they have the disposable masks available for customers and employees. If we do have an outbreak, making sure that we close the store immediately and send everybody home to the quarantine, and we sanitize the store fully with the sanitizing service. So those are all things that we are taking precautionary measures with. The health department has reached out to us because they do become aware of store closures. And so we are responding thoroughly with their inquiries as far as, did you sanitize? Did you send the employees home to quarantine? What are you doing to prevent future outbreaks? So these are all things that we're going to have to start revving back up now that the Christmas season is upon us, and making sure that our employees as well as our customers are well protected.
Appreciate that. So Matt, I'd like to jump into some meat and potatoes here, right? Because one of the things that we want to talk about is where the potential legal landmines, can be. And the challenge with that is we don't always know what they are and where they are, right? So as employers are maneuvering through these mandates and all the things that we've kind of already outlined, what do you think employers need to be the most concerned about as they kind of filter through all this and are preparing for these mandates?
Well, I think that is just the bottom line. Ultimately, employers by nature, they want to look at, what the costs are going to be for all this. Obviously, there's the costs of, the intellectual cost of the morale and, what type of employees you can retain and pursue. But then there's the financial cost, and there's a lot of uncertainty associated with that. So, we don't quite know what is going to be required, but what we do know is how previous laws have been implemented and what the trends are. And anybody that works in a risk management department or HR department, a lot of you folks here know that ultimately the responsibility is going to lie with the employer. So we're discussing what expenses are going to be. I think employers are ultimately going to have to be responsible for compensating employees during the time that they're being tested and during the time that they're going to get vaccinated to comply with the mandate. So it's not going to be enough to simply advise the employee of the mandate and tell them, hey, you got to go comply with this. You're going to have to compensate the employee for that. Now, that's not a rule yet, but ultimately, that's probably what's going to happen. Why is that going to happen? Because it becomes a condition of employment. If you're requiring an employee to do something as a condition of their employment, then they probably should be compensated for it. Now, that doesn't sound like much if you have 1, 2, 3 folks that you have to address, but a lot of the people here have, many employees. So, those costs are going to mount. So how do you get in front of that? What I would recommend is you start developing relationships with testing facilities or potentially clinics, vaccination clinics, or something of that nature. So you have some type of streamlined way to forward your employees along to where they need to go to comply with whatever the mandates might be in your particular state. So that would be my first piece of advice is start to develop those relationships now, because eventually that's going to be a cost that you're going to have to incur. And the last thing that you want to do is have an employee or multiple employees that are kind of stirring in the breeze, waiting for vaccinations or testing, and you don't know where they're at, what they're doing, what they're up to. There's also the issue of transportation of these facilities. So it's going to be incumbent upon the employer to kind of plan for that right now. Eventually, these mandates are going to become much more broad. We're talking about a federal mandate right now, 100+ employees. That's all good and well and good. But eventually, states are going to adopt their own mandates. The federal guidelines could become more stringent. So that's a way for employers to get ahead of it on the cost front. Get that accomplished now. Second way to do it is tighten up your HR policies. Everybody that works in HR, you're familiar with reasonable accommodations, and as I referenced before, interactive process. We know what we need to do, but that's going to be your safety net to addressing these issues. Either from government enforcement, if they want to say that XYZ employer wasn't complying with the mandate and we're going to look at fining them, or if it comes from a challenge from the individual employee for whatever it might be, discrimination, based on religion or disability or what have you, or even just kind of a broad-based challenge to it that it's infringing on somebody's rights. That way, at the very least, you'll have some documentation that the employee met with you, you discussed their concerns, it was filed appropriately, and you have something to rely on if it either becomes an issue from being fined by a federal agency or being sued by your employee or group of employees. And then when you do that, it's going to be done a little bit differently. Usually everybody's used to having a personnel file on the issue. I would recommend that you actually have a completely, separate file, because if there becomes an issue of confidentiality on a particular employee's privacy rights, be it, health, privacy, or whatever guidelines are going to allow them to claim some right of privacy, don't file that in their usual, common personnel file. So when you're doing the interactive process, when you're addressing their vaccination status, testing status, kind of keep a separate file in that respect. And then if government agency comes after you, or if employee wants to, issue a challenge as to what you're trying to accomplish, you have that file separate and apart, and you can go to it when you need to. There's quite a few challenges ahead, Josh. I wish we could kind of get all of them involved, but those would be the two chief ones. Try to get ahead of the cost concern, develop those relationships that you might not have yet with facilities, with healthcare providers, So then you can train your HR folks, internal folks on, how you're going to go about addressing it. A lot of internal HR departments are already well trained on workers' compensation. They know where to send their employee for a workplace injury. They have relationships with local clinics that they can send somebody who's injured. So I would just follow that kind of same blueprint, except this time a little bit different. Testing facilities, vaccination clinics, and those types of providers that you do with workers' comp issues. That way your folks, you can train them, they just will go to another set of standard operating procedures on how to run that issue there. And then of course, again, like I've said, your best friend in legal challenges is going to be the interactive process. So ensure that you engage any employee in the interactive process, whether there's any possible question of trepidation to getting the vaccine, not wanting to be tested, or even just kind of verbalizing their concern with, even folks who have been vaccinated, for instance, who don't want to come back to work for some reason. All that needs to be documented. Don't dismiss any employee's medical concern. Ultimately, the fact that you perform that interactive process, that's going to be, in essence, your get out of jail free card if anything happens that you want to have to deal with down the road.
Yeah, and you brought up a good point, right? Along with anything that we're doing in the insurance world, work comp, HR, documentation is always key, right? So, and I like the idea of having a separate file for that. Makes a lot of sense too, and avoid some of those landmines potentially as well, right? So, Brent, I'd like to get your thoughts on this too. With regard to the exemptions, right? And that's one of the big items that people are talking about, the religious exemption, medical exemption. How do you recommend that employers kind of navigate this? Because ultimately, I feel like they have almost been kind of tasked with being the arbiter on these kinds of things, right? Is this sufficient? Is it not? And I mean, I can envision there being some legal ramifications if the employee response is not favorable or whatnot. So as they're navigating through this specific process, how would you recommend that they proceed?
Well, I mean, the exemptions, I mean, people that want to try to claim, for example, the religious exemption, it's a sincerely held religious belief. And I think that the litigation on that is going to ramp up very quickly on what exactly does that mean. I mean, that could mean anything. You could hold a belief of anything that says that, you don't want to put anything into your body. But I think what's going to end up happening, for example, I had a friend of mine who came at me, he was asking me some legal questions. His employer's making him get vaccinated. He said, can I make a religious claim? I don't want to be vaccinated. And I said, well, is this legit? Like, do you truly have a religious claim against vaccination? He said, I absolutely do. And I said, well, has your employer ever funded any kind of flu vaccination programs? And he said, yes. I said, did you take advantage of those? And he said, yes. I said, well, it's going to make it a little bit more difficult for you to be now claiming a religious exemption against this vaccine when you've been taking the flu vaccine over the years. So it is a very, very difficult thing to even try to unwind, Josh, because there is so little guidance on what exactly that means. I can understand the medical side of it. If you have a doctor that says that you shouldn't be doing something like this or putting something like this in your body for whatever reasons, you could have some underlying conditions that you just shouldn't be taking any kind of vaccines. A doctor's note, that's going to be a pretty simple one for them to provide you evidence of. But it's all going to play itself out, right? I mean, we're just starting to see things in the news as we speak. There's big controversy over Southwest Airlines last weekend and whether or not the canceling of 2,000 flights was because of vaccine mandates and the pilots not wanting to do it, or was it not? And there was a big lawsuit that was filed by I think it was the LA County Sheriff's Department against the vaccine mandates, but those were a little bit different. Those were under the executive order, whether or not they have the power. So all this stuff's going to start playing out. Matt speaks to probably the greatest point, which is right now, until we get more guidance, caution, safety, interactive processes, document everything. You know, we don't know exactly how to mandate testing per se, how to record it, how to keep it. So just kind of keep yourself a separate file. He brings up excellent points in that regard. Right now, it's just, we got to live with what we got to live as an employers. We just got to go with the best cautionary matter that we have and make sure that we talk to our employees. If they have a legitimate concern over something, then we need to listen to what that legitimate concern is.
Got it. And I'm gonna give Tania a chance to share here, but before we do, I want to go to Matt. Just give me a 30-second answer here. If you put on your applicant attorney hat here for a second, and you're kind of just watching to see what develops, what unfolds, and you're looking for opportunities to go in there and file some sort of claim, what are you looking for? Is it more in the interactive process? Is it with regard to the exemptions? Is it regard to the way letters are worded, the way that people respond? If you're an applicant attorney, what are you looking for in the next handful of months?
Well, are we talking about workers' comp claims or just plaintiff claims?
I think just kind of generally speaking, maybe more so the employment law side of things.
Yeah, well, you're going to look at, you know, your wages. Number one, you know, are you being required to address certain health matters, and are you being paid for that? Are you being sent home to comply with, you know, certain health mandates, and are you being paid for that? And any plaintiff employment attorney is always going to look to whether there's a wage issue, because in every single state and at the federal level, you know, most of those wage claims carry attorney's fees when you bring those particular actions. Those are the easiest claims to prove. So that's the first thing you're gonna review. You're gonna say, hey, you sent my client to go get tested. He didn't get paid. He or she didn't get paid. That continued on multiple pay stubs, and it hasn't been resolved. So that's the first thing that's going to happen. You know, we're going to want to get ahead of that issue. That's why I brought up the point, create those relationships with testing facilities, because you can control the amount of time that's devoted to sending an employee to either be tested or vaccinated should they, you know, desire to do so, and you have that relationship. That way you're not dealing with some unknown, indeterminate period of time as to, you know, what wages are owed. Then, of course, it's, as Brent brought up, it's the religious accommodation, the disability accommodation. That's going to be the other piece of it. And that's kind of why I mentioned the interactive process. You're going to want to get some real hard evidence and commentary from the employee as to whether that's legit or not. So it's going to come down to wages and whether you actually heard the employee out on whether they had an exemption.
It sounds like the low-hanging fruit is probably with regard to those wages, right? So it sounds like you're recommending get some policies in place right away, figure out, A, if you're going to pay it. If you are, then make sure you do it, and you've got policies in place to, you know, to confirm that, to knock that out, because it sounds like that could be just obvious low-hanging fruit for applicant attorneys to go in there and seek those attorney.
Right, that's the next frontier of class action cases. You don't want to get hit with a class action for multiple employees that you sent out to get tested or vaccinated, and you didn't end up paying them. And then, like I said, if you don't have relationships with the places where they're going to, you're not going to be able to keep track of how much time that they took to get to whatever facility that they chose, or you gave them a list to choose. You're not going to know where they had to drive to. You might have some travel reimbursement that you never gave them. So you need to get ahead of that. You need to establish those relationships, because then if you don't, you know, determine that you're going to pay these folks, then you have a huge class action on your hands. You know, maybe it ends up just being, you know, 3-4 hours per employee, but anybody that's had a class action or had any involvement in a class action knows that kind of stuff adds up. And then the attorney's fees are huge. So, you know, plaintiff attorneys are kind of sitting back waiting for this one to come to fruition, or waiting for employers to make the mistake. This is kind of, you know, what happened when the wage and hour laws across the country first came into place. Plaintiff attorneys were just, you know, cleaning up on that until employers got wise and implemented policies, and, you know, we kind of addressed it. You don't see those types of claims as much, but this is, you know, just another step. Everybody knows anytime you have new laws that implement certain requirements of employers, it's going to impact your wages. And if employers don't plan ahead then we're playing catch up. We're playing defense on multiple class actions, all different jurisdictions. And that's not money that is going to be covered by, insurance coverage. Usually wage claims aren't covered in that sense. It's going to be a huge bite out of your bottom line.
Got it. So Tanya, I know you had to jump off, but I'm glad you jumped back on. So I'm going to ask you a general question because we've covered quite a few topics already. But in the next handful of months, what is the sort of the most pressing concern for you? What are you most focused on as you look toward these mandates and kind of the next steps? What is the action plan, generally speaking, for the next couple of months?
Well, for the next couple of months, I think it's going to be a little challenging. I mean, force, it's not Asian. But we are, and then that's being so. But I think more of trying to get, just try to convince them that, the vaccination is the way to go.
Got it. I think you were cutting in a little bit in and out there, so I had a little bit of a tough time hearing you, Tanya. But I think what I heard is that it sounds like there may have been communication was going to be important, and maybe kind of recommending it rather than forcing the mandate, which I've heard quite a few employers kind of mention previously. So sorry about that, Tanya. We couldn't get your.
I'm so sorry. I know my.
Okay.
Yeah, and if I could just speak to that too, Josh. I mean, I think the
connection is a little spotty, but definitely, yeah.
Oh, sorry, I think the individuals we have on the panel here that are on the employer side can advise. It's all well and good to try to pass the buck on to the government agencies on what they're requiring and what they're doing, and I think that's probably a good strategy because you're not taking an ideological position on the issue, but considering where we're moving, and if you look at just what does the public at large want here, the majority of folks are in favor of, in some respect, some type of mandates or some type of vaccination enforceability, and you kind of look at those trends as to where things are going to go and where the next laws are going to go. So as I mentioned before, I think we're going to see over time. We're starting with this initial mandate, but then, I think states are going to issue their mandates. I think federal mandates can get a little bit more tight. So, if you're taking the position as an employer that, hey, this is what they're making us do, and just kind of giving them the laws, that makes sense in some respect. But I would also encourage employers to some degree to have some type of educational component with respect to the vaccination and the testing and workplace safety, because that way, you're providing the employees, obviously respecting their freedom of choice, but I think it's important to provide appropriate education on, why some of these mandates are coming down the pipe. And you don't have to take a major role in that, but issuance of a pamphlet, some literature, something, I believe over time would be recommended on the employer side. In addition, just to giving them the laws, I would also take that extra step and try to do something on an education level.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. I mean, I think that's kind of the key to, in many aspects, is the communication, right? Is to over communicate your position, provide them the resources needed to help make an informed decision, kind of information as to the why and the how. I think all of that will absolutely benefit the majority of employers. So we are coming right up, button up to about the end of our time. So what I wanted to do is just give everybody a chance, maybe some sort of closing statement, any last thoughts, any recommendations for your colleagues. Maybe just keep it to about a minute. And Brent, maybe I'll just start with you. Any sort of last thoughts on where we go from here?
I mean, it really is a wait and see approach. I think that you should do, as an employer, do what is best for your company, and kind of follow what the trend is going to be, in my opinion. And I agree with Matt 100%. It's education over sort of just providing them with alarming things. Provide them a little bit of background on the implementation of certain things, new policies in your office if you're bringing people back into your office, things of that nature. Don't just sort of roll it out as a black and white type thing. Just kind of let people know why it's happening, and make sure you document everything.
Great job. Liz, any last words, any last thoughts?
Yes. One thing that I think is very important that we didn't touch on is that anyone that is viewing medical documentation, medical notes, is very important that you be HIPAA certified. So that's another loophole that could get you, because, you know, we have had employees say, well, you know, I don't want you to be privy to my medical information. We do notify our employees that those of us that are HIPAA certified have the rights to see that medical documentation. So that is very, very important. Become HIPAA certified to ensure that you can handle and see those medical documents. And overall, definitely seek the counsel of your legal team to make sure that you are dotting those I's and crossing those T's, and be proactive and think about every possible loophole that could come up and get that covered.
Great point about the HIPAA certification. I definitely wrote that down as a takeaway. So thank you for that. Tony, I'd like to get just some last thoughts from you.
Last thoughts directed to California employers. If you have concerns about OSHA, their next meeting is October 21st. I just put a link to the meeting where you can attend, is on October 21st. I encourage all employers to attend the webinar or the web meeting, and they do have public comments too as well, but you can at least listen to OSHA, how those meetings work, and maybe get some insight on where California is going next.
Thanks for that, Tony. And I'll definitely take that link, and I will send it to any of the attendees that are on today. I'll make sure that you guys have access to that link, along with Brent and Matt's contact information, in case you guys want to reach out and have any legal discussions that you would like to flesh out. I'm sure they can answer, field any of those questions at a later date too, since there was quite a few questions and some good buzz in the Q&A section, chat function. So thanks for that. Veda, let's get your kind of last thoughts just on what next steps look like.
Next steps, again, employers, continue to encourage your employees, to get vaccinated. I think that's just one of our big things, is get vaccinated. Educate, offer incentives if you have to get your workforce vaccinated. Again, I think like Matthew was talking about, the pay for their travel time, pay for the time off. I just lost you guys.
We got you, Veda.
Do you have me? Okay,
Yep.
I'm totally off. But yeah, so pay for their travel time, offer them incentives, but do whatever you can do to start encouraging your employees to get that vaccination. I mean, it's free. The more people that we get vaccinated, the more we get back to trying to get into that sense of normal again.
Thanks for that, Veda. And that's a good point you touched on too, is the incentives, right? We didn't get a chance to get into that, but I know there's been some employers that, short of the mandate, are incentivizing heavily some of their employees. So that was a good point you brought up too. So Tania, let's give this a shot here. Let's see if we've got the audio go. Do you want to give us sort of a 30 seconds last thoughts?
Absolutely. Same here. The same as what Veda said, you know, we are trying to incentivize. That's the first step. Another very important step is patient. If the educational information to the incentives, I think that goes along. So I think that would be my last employer
The door closed.
to get their workforce vaccinated.
Thank you for that. Thank you for that. No, that was a great point. So it sounds like the takeaways are education and incentives for Tania. So that brings us to right about the conclusion of today's discussion. I want to thank everybody for joining us, both all the attendees and also all the panels, and for everyone for giving up your lunch today to share your thoughts, your experiences with the industry. I think there's definitely plenty of takeaways, and with all of your backgrounds and sort of diverse cross-section of job experiences, titles, and all of that, I think it definitely helps to kind of shed some light on both the challenges we're facing, kind of what the next couple of months are going to look like, and then just the reality that there's quite a few unknowns in this whole process. So definitely appreciate all of your availability, experiences, and perspective. So we'll go ahead and sign off, and thanks again to everybody, and
Thanks for
have a great
having
day.
us.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Josh, for
Thank you.
setting everything up.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Thanks, guys.
thank you.
Appreciate it.
Thank you
Thank
so
you.
much for having us.
Bye-bye.
Okay, bye.